What if I told you that the moment everything in your life feels like it is falling apart is often the exact moment right before everything begins to come together? Because the truth is this: major blessing rarely arrives dressed as comfort. It often arrives disguised as pressure, confusion, and even loss. And most people miss it because they misread the signs. And right now, you might be in a season where things feel uncertain. Doors closing, people leaving, delays increasing. And you're asking yourself, what is happening to my life? But what if nothing is going wrong and everything is actually being rearranged? Stay with me, because if you recognize these signs, you may not be in a season of decline. You may be standing on the edge of a major breakthrough. Before elevation, life often enters a season where comfort begins to break down. Not randomly, but deliberately, in ways that feel confusing at first. What once felt stable starts to feel slightly misaligned. Routines that used to bring peace may begin to feel heavy or empty. This is usually the first sign that a person is no longer growing inside the limits of their current environment. It is not that the environment has suddenly become bad, but that the individual has begun to outgrow what it can offer. In this phase, there is often a subtle but persistent inner unrest. Decisions that once felt easy now require deeper thought. Familiar paths start to feel repetitive, almost like they are no longer producing the same internal satisfaction. This discomfort is not meaningless. It is often the beginning of internal expansion. Growth rarely announces itself with clarity at the start. Instead, it first appears as dissatisfaction with what used to be enough. During this time, people may also experience emotional friction. Things that were once tolerated begin to feel harder to ignore. This can include relationships, habits, or environments that no longer match the direction of personal development. It can feel like life is shaking things, but what is actually happening is a recalibration of alignment. What cannot support the next level of responsibility starts to feel increasingly incompatible. There is also a tendency in this season to question oneself more deeply. Thoughts like, something feels off, or I can't stay here mentally anymore, begin to surface. This is not instability. It is awareness expanding beyond previous limits. The mind starts recognizing gaps between current reality and emerging potential, and that gap creates tension. Most people interpret this discomfort as a sign to retreat, but it is often a signal to prepare, because before expansion, stability is intentionally disturbed, so dependency on comfort is broken. When comfort is no longer the anchor, growth becomes the only direction left to engage with. Isolation during a major life shift is rarely accidental, even though it feels emotionally disorienting when it begins. There comes a phase where certain people naturally become less present, conversations feel less frequent, and the inner world starts to feel quieter than before. On the surface, this can resemble abandonment or distance, but beneath it, something deeper is happening. The environment around a person often adjusts when their internal direction begins to change, because not everything and not everyone is meant to accompany the next stage of growth. In this period, solitude becomes more noticeable. You may find yourself spending more time alone, not necessarily by choice at first, but as a natural consequence of shifting priorities, changing values, or even misunderstandings that create separation. What once felt socially active or emotionally engaging begins to lose its pull. This can feel uncomfortable, especially when connection has been a source of identity or stability. But isolation in this context is not simply absence, it is recalibration. When external noise reduces, internal awareness increases. Thoughts that were previously drowned out by interaction, distraction, or routine begin to surface more clearly. This can feel intense because silence amplifies reflection. You begin to notice your own patterns more sharply, your motivations more honestly, and your direction more clearly. In this space, self-awareness deepens in ways that constant social engagement rarely allows. There is also a purification process that often occurs during isolation. Certain relationships fade not because of conflict alone, but because they no longer align with the emerging version of you. This is not always mutual or planned. It can feel sudden, but it is often the result of internal transformation that changes what you naturally resonate with. Some connections cannot survive when identity begins to evolve. Although isolation may initially feel like loss, it gradually becomes a space where dependency on external validation weakens. The need for constant approval, explanation, or emotional reassurance begins to reduce. In its place, a quieter form of confidence starts forming, one that is not dependent on presence of others, but on clarity within self. This phase is not about being alone for its own sake, but about being separated from what would dilute direction. It is in this reduced noise that internal strength is refined and clarity begins to take shape more distinctly than before. There is a stage in personal growth where relationships and environments begin to lose their former alignment without any dramatic announcement. It does not always happen through conflict. More often, it happens through subtle distance, reduced resonance, and a quiet sense that what once felt natural no longer feels the same. This shift is not random. It usually reflects an internal transformation that is already underway, where identity, priorities, and perception are no longer matching the same frequency as before. In this phase, conversations may start to feel less meaningful or less engaging than they used to. People who once felt closely connected may begin to feel emotionally distant, even if no visible disagreement has taken place. This can be confusing because the history is still there, but the emotional alignment is not. What is changing is not just relationships themselves, but the individual's capacity to stay fully connected to dynamics that no longer reflect their inner direction. Environments also begin to feel different. Places that once felt comfortable may start to feel limiting or stagnant. Activities that once brought enjoyment may feel repetitive or uninspiring. This is not because those environments have changed, but because perception has changed. When internal growth accelerates, external surroundings that do not evolve at the same pace naturally begin to feel out of sync. There is often an emotional resistance to this phase because letting go is not always conscious. It can feel like things are slipping away rather than being released. However, what is actually happening is a natural sorting process. Connections that are not aligned with the next stage of development begin to weaken, while those that are aligned often remain steady or even deepen. During this time, identity also plays a major role. As a person begins to think differently, value differently, and respond differently, not every relationship can adjust to that change. Some dynamics are built around past versions of the self, and when that version evolves, the structure holding those connections begins to loosen. What feels like loss in this stage is often transition. It is the movement from environments that supported who you were into spaces that can support who you are becoming. There is a noticeable shift that often happens when a person begins moving toward a deeper sense of purpose, where their interest in distractions starts to fade without force or effort. Things that once consumed attention, time, or emotional energy no longer carry the same appeal. It is not necessarily that those things become bad, but rather that the internal appetite for them begins to weaken naturally. Entertainment, unnecessary social noise, or habits that once felt engaging start to feel less meaningful, almost like they no longer match the direction of the mind and spirit. At the same time, there is a quiet but powerful increase in desire for something more meaningful. This is not always immediately clear or defined. It may not appear as a fully formed goal at first, but rather as a growing dissatisfaction with superficial engagement. Conversations may feel less interesting if they lack depth. Environments may feel less fulfilling if they lack purpose. Even personal routines may begin to feel misaligned if they do not contribute to growth. This shift often creates an internal contrast. On one side, old patterns are losing their grip, and on the other, something deeper is pulling attention forward. This can feel like restlessness, but it is actually a reordering of priorities. The mind starts to become less tolerant of distractions that consume energy without contributing to direction. There is a growing awareness that time and focus are limited resources, and not everything deserves access to them anymore. In this stage, even solitude can feel different. It is no longer just absence of activity, but space where thoughts begin to reorganize. Reflection becomes more frequent. Questions about purpose, direction, and long-term meaning start to surface more consistently. What used to be ignored or postponed begins to demand attention. This growing hunger for purpose is often accompanied by a reduction in tolerance for inconsistency, both within oneself and in external environments. There is a stronger desire for alignment, clarity, and intentional living. The internal compass becomes more sensitive, making it harder to ignore what feels misaligned. What is unfolding is not a loss of interest in life, but a shift in what defines a fulfilling life, where depth begins to replace distraction as the primary source of engagement. If this message is resonating with you, pause for a moment and reflect. Which of these signs are you currently experiencing? And if you want more insight on seasons like this, seasons of pressure, preparation, and breakthrough, subscribe and stay connected, because what you are stepping into requires understanding, not just motivation. There is a pattern that often appears just before a major shift in life, where things begin to feel unusually resistant, as if progress is being slowed down at every step. Plans that once moved smoothly start encountering delays, unexpected obstacles, or repeated revisions. This can feel frustrating, especially when effort is being applied consistently, yet results seem delayed or inconsistent. However, this stage is not always a sign of failure or misdirection. It is often a phase where pressure increases right before expansion becomes possible. In this period, even simple actions may require more patience than usual. Opportunities might seem to pause at the final stage, or outcomes may take longer to materialize. It can feel like momentum has been interrupted. Emotionally, this creates tension because the natural expectation is that effort should immediately produce visible progress. But in seasons of transformation, timing often operates differently from expectation. Resistance also appears internally, not just externally. Doubt may increase, even when direction is still present. Questions like, "Why is this not working yet?" or "Am I doing something wrong?" begin to surface more frequently. This internal friction is part of the experience because the mind is adjusting to a pace that no longer matches previous patterns of growth. What is often misunderstood in this stage is that resistance can function as refinement. When something is about to increase in size, responsibility, or visibility, it often requires a stronger internal structure. Pressure reveals weaknesses that need to be strengthened before expansion can safely occur. Without this strengthening phase, increased capacity could become overwhelming rather than empowering. There is also a recalibration happening during resistance. Not every delay is random. Some delays redirect energy away from paths that are not aligned with long-term development. What feels like blockage may sometimes be protection or redirection toward a more suitable timing or environment. This phase requires patience because acceleration after refinement is often more stable and sustainable. What is being tested is not only endurance, but also consistency in mindset when external progress appears slower than expected. The pressure is not designed to stop movement, but to ensure that when movement resumes, it is supported by greater strength and clarity. There is a stage before visible change where a person begins to be tested in ways that are not immediately obvious to others, but are deeply significant in shaping who they are becoming. This testing is not always about major life events. Often it appears in small, repeated situations that reveal how a person behaves when no one is watching, when pressure is subtle but consistent, and when choices carry quiet consequences. What is being refined here is not appearance or performance, but character at its foundation. In this phase, situations begin to surface that expose patterns in decision-making. How a person handles inconvenience, delay, frustration, or emotional discomfort becomes more noticeable. It is not that these situations are new, but that they now carry more weight than before. Small responses begin to matter more because they reflect deeper internal stability. Patience is tested in moments where waiting feels unnecessary. Integrity is tested when shortcuts appear easier. Discipline is tested when consistency requires effort without immediate reward. There is also a growing awareness of inner reactions during this stage. A person may notice how quickly they respond emotionally, how easily they are influenced by external pressure, or how strongly they depend on validation. These observations are not accidental. They are part of a refining process where awareness is increased so that change becomes possible. Without awareness, adjustment cannot happen at a deeper level. What makes this stage significant is that it often occurs privately. There may be no external recognition of the challenges being faced. Life continues outwardly in a normal way, but internally, decisions are being shaped that will influence future outcomes. The foundation of future responsibility is being built in these unseen moments. This testing phase also reveals consistency. It is not about occasional good behavior, but about repeated alignment between values and actions, even when circumstances are inconvenient. Where there is inconsistency, correction becomes necessary. Where there is steadiness, preparation for expansion becomes possible. The purpose of this stage is not punishment or limitation, but strengthening. Before visibility increases, stability must increase first. Character is refined so that when greater responsibility arrives, it does not destabilize the individual, but instead supports sustainable growth. There is a phase in personal development where timing begins to feel unusual, almost as if life is not responding at the speed you expect, even though effort and intention are still present. Plans that once seemed ready to unfold immediately begin to stretch out. Opportunities that felt close begin to pause at the edge of realization. This experience can create confusion because it looks like inactivity from the outside, but internally, something deeper is being structured. In this stage, repeated delays are not simply obstacles, they often serve as a form of refinement for readiness. What appears to be postponed may actually be undergoing alignment. The delay is not always about denial of the outcome itself, but about preparation for the conditions required to sustain that outcome. When something carries long-term weight or responsibility, it often requires timing that supports stability rather than urgency. During this period, emotional interpretation plays a major role. It becomes easy to assume that delay means rejection or lack of progress, especially when comparison is involved. However, what is not immediately visible is that certain paths are being shaped in the background in ways that are not yet ready to surface. The absence of immediate results does not necessarily indicate absence of movement. It can indicate invisible preparation. There is also a strengthening of patience that begins to form in this season. The individual is gradually being separated from impulsive timing, where decisions are driven by urgency rather than alignment. Waiting becomes more than endurance, it becomes observation. In this space, clarity often increases because the noise of constant acceleration is reduced. Another important aspect of this stage is trust in process without external validation. When timing does not match expectation, internal conviction is tested. The question shifts from "why is this not happening yet?" to to a quieter form of understanding that timing may be structured around factors beyond immediate perception. This phase also protects from premature outcomes. Some results, if received too early, may not have the foundation needed to last. Delay in this sense can function as a safeguard for long-term stability rather than a barrier to progress. What is unfolding is not absence of movement, but alignment of conditions so that when progression becomes visible, it carries durability rather than instability. There is a stage in personal development where something begins to strengthen internally, even though nothing around you seems to confirm it. On the outside, circumstances may remain unchanged, progress may not yet be visible, and external validation may be absent or delayed. Yet inside, there is a growing sense of certainty that does not depend on what is currently happening in the environment. This is what it feels like when inner conviction starts to deepen beyond external conditions. In earlier stages, confidence is often shaped by feedback, results, or encouragement from others. It depends on visible proof that something is working. But in this phase, that structure begins to shift. Even without confirmation, there is an internal steadiness that starts to form. It is not loud or emotional in a dramatic way, but quiet and persistent. It remains present even when doubt appears externally or when progress seems unclear. This kind of conviction does not usually develop in comfort. It often grows in seasons where answers are delayed and clarity is not immediately available. Because external signals are reduced, internal awareness becomes more sensitive. A person begins to notice what feels aligned, even if it is not yet proven. There is a subtle but increasing trust in direction, even when the outcome is still unfolding. During this phase, uncertainty does not necessarily disappear, but it loses some of its influence. Questions may still arise, but they no longer fully control decision-making. Instead of relying on visible validation, choices begin to be guided by internal alignment. This creates a shift in how decisions are made, where inner clarity slowly becomes more influential than external opinion. There is also a strengthening of resilience in this stage. When conviction is not dependent on immediate results, setbacks do not destabilize the same way. Delays, silence, or lack of recognition do not completely disrupt forward movement. Instead, they become part of the process that is being interpreted internally rather than externally. Over time, this internal conviction becomes a stabilizing force. It allows a person to continue moving even when the environment does not reflect progress yet, creating a form of persistence that is not easily influenced by external fluctuation. And so, when you understand these signs together, you begin to realize something important. The process is not random, and neither is the pressure. What feels like confusion is often preparation. What feels like delay is often alignment. And what feels like isolation, resistance, or loss is often the restructuring of your life for something you are not yet fully equipped to see. Big change rarely announces itself with comfort. It first confronts what is unstable, what is outdated, and what cannot support the next level. That is why certain seasons feel intense before they feel rewarding. They are not designed to break you down, but to build capacity within you that matches what is coming next. If you are experiencing these signs, the worst interpretation is that nothing is happening. In reality, something is forming beneath the surface that requires time, maturity, and preparation. The visible outcome always arrives after the internal structure is ready to hold it. So instead of resisting the process, there is wisdom in recognizing it. Because when you can read the signs correctly, you stop mislabeling preparation as failure. You stop confusing transition with loss. And you begin to move with more awareness, patience, and stability through what is unfolding. And when the timing finally opens, what once felt delayed begins to make sense with clarity that only hindsight could explain.